The Gulf of Mexico wind had a way of biting at exposed skin, even in Florida. Pensacola was beautiful from a distance, palm trees swaying against a golden coastline. But to the recruits standing in formation, it might as well have been hell disguised in sunlight. Every grain of sand, every crashing wave seemed designed to grind them down. The instructors paced with predator eyes. No smiles, no warmth. Only the promise that most of these men wouldn't make it. That morning, Jake removed his shirt as ordered, preparing for the swim test. His chest rose and fell steadily, though his heartbeat thudded in his ears. The Gulf shimmered like steel behind him, but it wasn't the water that caught attention. It was the ink carved across his shoulder. At first, only 1 or 2 recruits noticed, but soon nearly everyone was glancing sideways at it. The tattoo wasn't flashy. It didn't scream for attention. Yet, it pulled eyes like a magnet. Sharp lines interlaced with precision, forming a pattern that seemed deliberate, as if each angle carried meaning. "Looks like you brought your resume on your arm," one recruit muttered under his breath. Another chuckled nervously. "Maybe it's a cheat code. Press the right spot. He turns into Aquaman." Laughter rose, short-lived, and just as quickly died. Because Jake didn't laugh, didn't even smirk. He just kept stretching, muscles taut, tattoo flexing like a shadow stitched to his skin. Silence made the mark louder. When the whistle blew, the men plunged into the ocean. Salt water burned eyes and lungs. Currents shoved against them like invisible fists. Jake swam with methodical strokes, not the fastest, not the slowest, always steady. When he emerged from the surf, water cascading off him, the tattoo gleamed darker against his pale skin, and the whispers began. The barracks smelled of sweat, brine, and disinfectant. At night, men collapsed onto their bunks, bodies broken, blisters raw. Most groaned themselves to sleep. But for those who couldn't drift off, curiosity found its outlet. "What the hell do you think it is?" a wiry recruit asked one night, staring at the mark as Jake cleaned sand from his boots. "Some kind of code?" Another suggested. "Looks like angles. Could be coordinates or something. Or maybe he just thought it looked badass," the first said, though even he didn't sound convinced. Jake didn't acknowledge them. He slid his boots under the bunk, sat down, and began tightening the straps on his gear. His face was calm, unreadable. If their voices reached him, he gave no sign. It was unnerving. Most tattoos came with stories, drunken mistakes in foreign ports, women's names inked in shaky cursive, barbed wire wrapped around biceps like trophies. Men liked to brag, to explain, but this one was different. It demanded explanation, yet none came. That silence began to shape the way others saw him. Some thought it arrogance. Others thought it was focus. Either way, they couldn't ignore it. Days blurred together in pain. Push-ups in sand until arms trembled. Log carries that crushed shoulders raw. Surf torture where the ocean swallowed recruits whole and spat them back, teeth chattering so hard their jaws ached. Through it all, the tattoo was there, a constant like the waves. Even the instructors noticed. Chief Petty Officer Ramirez, whose voice could shatter stone, stopped during inspection one morning. His gaze snagged on the mark. For half a second, his expression shifted curiosity, maybe recognition before he barked the next order. "Hit the deck. Push-ups, all of you." The recruits dropped, groaning, but Ramirez's eyes lingered one moment longer on the tattoo before he turned away. By the 3rd week, the mark had become legend. Some said it was a family crest. Others swore it was a secret unit symbol. No one knew the truth, and Jake never told them. One evening, after a brutal day of running soft sand trails and carrying boats overhead, the barracks fell into tired silence. The men sat polishing rifles, sore hands moving mechanically. The recruit on the bunk across from him finally broke. "Hey," he said, voice rough. "That tattoo. What's it mean?" For the first time, Jake looked up. His eyes locked onto his bunkmates with an intensity that froze the air. "It means I don't quit," he said. 6 words, spoken flat, like a steel blade drawn from its sheath. The others waited for Moria's story, a smile, a laugh, but nothing came. He returned to polishing his gear, silence settling like stone around him. That night, no one whispered about it. But from that moment forward, the tattoo was no longer just decoration. It became a silent mantra. When exhaustion threatened to break them, when lungs burned and muscles gave out, they'd glance at him. The mark seemed to carry them forward, as if his refusal to explain gave it more weight. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't vanity. It was a promise. And promises in SEAL training were worth more than sleep, more than food, more than air. The second month of BUD/S training was where illusions died. The first weeks had already stripped away layers of pride, muscle, and ego, but by now only endurance mattered. Sand rubbed skin raw, salt water stung open wounds, and every day felt like a war fought with one's own body. For the recruits who remained, a strange rhythm developed. Mornings began before sunrise, bodies trembling awake, boots pounding sand. Afternoons blurred with runs, swims, and carries that stretched until time itself lost meaning. Nights ended in barracks, where groans replaced laughter, and silence felt heavier than any log they carried. Yet within that grind, brotherhood began to take root. Shared pain had a way of binding men together. Caleb, from Texas, once quick with jokes, now carried the same boat on his head as Ethan, the wiry Floridian beside him. They cursed the same waves, endured the same cold. Even the instructor's insults started to feel like background noise compared to the real enemy, exhaustion. But through it all, one presence stood apart. Jake, with the tattoo. It wasn't that he rejected camaraderie. He worked with the team, carried weight, locked arms in the surf, but he was quieter than the rest. Measured where others cracked jokes to mask fear. He simply moved, each action deliberate. His silence was not unfriendly, but it set him apart. And the tattoo it followed him everywhere. During push-ups on the grinder, sand grinding into their palms, his sleeve would ride up, revealing the black mark. During swims, as they stripped shirts to dry, the ink seemed darker, more defined. During inspections, under the instructor's hawk-like eyes, it drew attention without him ever intending it. To the men around him, it became something they couldn't shake. "Swear it's a Ranger thing," Caleb whispered one night. "No, it's too sharp. Looks like Navy, but old school," Ethan muttered. "You ever gonna tell us?" another finally asked. Jake kept his eyes on his boots, polishing them with mechanical precision. He said nothing. That silence was answer enough. As scrutiny intensified, some recruits tested him in subtle ways. During team runs, they'd push the pace, glancing sideways to see if he'd falter. He never did. During log PT, when the weight of oak crushed down on 6 shoulders, someone would whisper, "Hey, tattoo, don't slip." He never slipped. And though they never said it aloud, a grudging respect began to form. But not everyone was convinced. Silence can look like arrogance, and arrogance was poison in the brotherhood. A few recruits muttered that he thought himself better than them, that the tattoo was a mark of superiority. The instructors seemed to sense it, too. Chief Ramirez, scarred jaw tight with authority, often called him out during drills. "You think ink makes you hard, son?" he barked during a beach run, his voice cutting through wind and waves. "Prove it. Get to the front." So he did. Step after punishing step, lungs searing, he pushed ahead, sand dragging like chains. He stayed there until the run ended, collapsing into the surf with the others. He never complained. Another time, during surf torture, Ramirez lingered near him, watching as the waves slammed cold against their bodies. His eyes locked on the tattoo, as though searching for something hidden. Then he moved on without a word. The barracks became a crucible of whispers. One evening after lights out, voices carried low across bunks. "You see how Ramirez looks at him? Like he knows something. Maybe it's some classified unit. Black Ops shit. He's too young for that. Maybe it's not his tattoo. Maybe it's his brother's or father's." Jake lay on his back, eyes open in the dark, hearing every word. He didn't respond. He never did. But inside, silence was not empty. It was heavy with memory. He thought of his father's medals gathering dust in a shoebox, of his brother's photograph, folded at the edges, tucked inside his gear, of the ink burning into his skin the night he carved their stories into lines. They didn't need to know. Not yet. Respect, however, is born in moments of trial. It happened during a log carry, the kind designed to break spines and spirits. 6 men hoisted the oak beam onto their shoulders, staggering across sand as the instructor shouted. Sweat-stung eyes, shoulders screamed in agony. One recruit slipped, knees buckling. The log tilted, threatening to crush them all. Without hesitation, Jake shifted, sliding under the weight. His legs shook, veins straining, but he bore the load long enough for the other man to recover. The team steadied, pushing forward. Afterward, when they dropped the log, gasping in the dirt, the rescued recruit sat in silence, staring at him. No words passed, but something changed. A debt had been written, not in ink, but in blood and pain. Camaraderie deepened. The jokes returned, lighter this time, more out of nerves than brotherhood. They laughed about blisters, about the instructor's creative insults, about the misery that somehow kept them alive. And still, the tattoo lingered in their minds. It had become more than ink. It was a riddle, a shadow stitched to his flesh. Some respected it, others resented it, but none could ignore it. Jake carried it all the same, silent as the sea. By the end of the second month, the team had begun to transform. Where once they were strangers, they now moved as one. Boats lifted smoother. Runs felt tighter. Swims cut sharper lines through the surf. The instructors noticed. Ramirez gave fewer direct challenges. His eyes, however, never stopped lingering on the tattoo, and the recruits noticed, too. They began to whisper less, not because curiosity had died, but because they were beginning to understand something. Whatever the tattoo meant, it was not decoration. It was not vanity. It was weight. And weight in the world of seals was something every man carried in his own way. Still, there was unease. A tattoo had not been explained, and mystery breeds questions. One night, as rain hammered the roof of the barracks, Ethan finally said what others had thought for weeks. "Whatever that thing means," he muttered, staring at the ceiling. "It's not just his story. It's ours now, too. Because if he doesn't quit, then we can't either." Silence followed. No one argued. On his bunk, Jake closed his eyes, the faintest shadow of a smile crossing his lips. Not arrogance, not pride, just understanding. The tattoo was no longer only his. It was becoming theirs. The tattoo was a riddle to the men around him, but to Jake himself, it was never a mystery. It was a story, one written long before he had drawn breath. A story carved in blood, loss, and sacrifice. It began in another war, in another generation. His father, William, had been 19 when the draft notice arrived. The year was 1968, the height of Vietnam. He was a farm boy from Nebraska, raised on cornfields and long summers, where the horizon stretched farther than ambition. His life had been simple: school, chores, church on Sundays. Then the government called, and he was shipped to a jungle half a world away. Vietnam was not a war of glory. It was a war of mud, of ambushes that came like ghosts in the night, of friends bleeding out in silence because rescue couldn't reach them. William carried scars no one could see. When he returned home in 1972, America didn't welcome him with parades. Instead, people spat at him, cursed him, blamed him for decisions he had never made. He folded his uniform into a box and never wore it again. He buried his medals in a drawer, never showing them to anyone. But inside, the war never left. He raised his son with quiet strength, discipline. Yes, respect always. But beneath his words lived an unspoken truth. That service demanded more than most men could give, and sometimes it took more than a man had to lose. Then came Michael, Jake's brother, 7 years older, the family's pride. Strong, charismatic, the kind of young man who carried confidence like a weapon. When he announced he was joining the army, William's jaw tightened, but his eyes carried both fear and pride. Michael was sent to Iraq in 2006, in the heat of insurgency. His letters home were short, rarely describing the horrors he faced. "We're fine," he'd write. "We're doing our job." But in 2007, the letters stopped. A black car pulled into the driveway one summer morning in Lincoln. 2 officers in dress uniforms stepped out. Jake, barely 16, watched from the porch as his mother collapsed in the doorway. William stood silent, face like stone, but his hands shook as he signed the papers. The funeral was a blur: flags, rifles, taps echoing across the cemetery. Jake remembered only the folded flag pressed into his mother's arms, and the look in his father's eyes, a hollow grief that would never heal. From that day on, silence became the language of their house. The tattoo came years later, not out of impulse, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. Jake had designed it himself late at night in a sketchbook smudged with pencil lines and eraser marks. Each angle represented something: a battle, a sacrifice, a man whose name was carved into his family's story. One line for William's lost brothers in Vietnam, another for Michael in Iraq. Together, The marks formed a map of grief, of endurance, of survival. He sat in the chair of a small tattoo parlor on the edge of Lincoln, the buzzing needle filling the silence. Pain lanced through him with every stroke, but he welcomed it. Pain was proof. Pain was memory. When it was done, he looked in the mirror at the mark carved across his shoulder. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't meant to be. It was a scar made permanent. It was his vow never to forget, never to quit. And now, years later, standing on the sands of Pensacola, surrounded by men who whispered about its meaning, he bore that vow like armor. He let them guess, let them mock, let them wonder, because to explain it would be to cheapen it, and the dead deserved more than casual explanations. There were nights when memories refused to stay buried. In the barracks, when others slept, Jake sometimes lay awake staring at the ceiling, the tattoo burning like fire on his skin. He remembered Michael's laugh, loud and careless. He remembered the last time they had thrown a football in the yard, grass stained on their jeans, William sitting behind them. He remembered the folded flag. Those memories fueled him in training. When cold waves stole his breath, he thought of the jungles William had crawled through, leeches clinging to his skin. When exhaustion turned his legs to stone, he thought of Michael's convoy ambushed outside Fallujah, how he had fought until his last breath. Pain was not his enemy. Quitting was. And so, when he whispered those 6 words, "It means I don't quit," he wasn't lying. It was the truest thing he had ever said. The others could never know the full story. Not yet. They weren't ready to carry that weight. Brotherhood was still forming, trust still fragile. To spill his history too soon would risk turning it into gossip, into curiosity stripped of its sacredness. But slowly, piece by piece, his actions began to reveal the truth without words. When a teammate faltered, he carried them. When instructors pushed them to the edge, he steadied the line. When fear cracked through the group, his silence anchored them. The tattoo became a story others told. Guy never quits. Strongest bastard in the class. Whatever that mark means, it's keeping him alive. And in a way, they were right. The tattoo was more than ink. It was lineage. It was blood. It was a silent history binding him to men who had fought before he was born. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of drowning drills, hands tied, feet bound, forced into the pool like sinking stones, Jake sat on the edge of his bunk, toweling off. His body ached, lungs still burning. The room was quiet, men too exhausted to speak. Then Ethan broke the silence. "My uncle was in Desert Storm," he said quietly, not looking at anyone. "He never talks about it. Just drinks a lot. I think he's still there in his head." Caleb nodded. "My old man too. He came back from Iraq different. Doesn't sleep much. Gets jumpy." Others shared fragments, fathers, uncles, brothers who had served, some who had come home, some who hadn't. Jake listened, silent. His towel hung limp in his hands. He didn't speak, but his chest tightened. For a moment, the barracks wasn't just a room full of recruits. It was a room full of legacies, each man carrying a ghost. No one mentioned the tattoo. They didn't need to. As the weeks dragged on, the whispers about the mark began to change. Curiosity gave way to something closer to reverence. It was no longer seen as arrogance, but as mystery, and in the world of men breaking themselves for a chance at greatness, mystery was sometimes the only thing that kept them standing. Jake never confirmed their guesses, never told them of William's medals or Michael's folded flag. But his silence was no longer a wall. It was a shield for them as much as for himself. Because if they knew the truth, they might carry it too. And some burdens, he believed, were his alone. Yet as the weeks turned into months, he felt the weight of history pressing harder, not as a chain, but as a compass. The tattoo wasn't just a reminder of where he had come from. It was a guide for where he was going. He knew what William had endured. He knew what Michael had given. And he knew he could not stop here. The tattoo was his inheritance. The sealed trident was his destiny. And together, they were the only way to honor the dead. Hell Week began in darkness, not the darkness of night, but the darkness of confusion, when time no longer mattered, when men couldn't tell if the sun had risen or set, when all that existed was cold and pain. The instructors called it the crucible. Recruits called it something worse, though most were too tired to name it. 5.5 days, barely 4 hours of sleep total, hours upon hours of running, swimming, carrying logs, pushing boats. Men lost 20 pounds in less than a week. Some lost their minds. Most lost their will. Jake stood in formation with his team, boots heavy with seawater, uniform already caked with sand. His eyes stung from salt and sleeplessness. His stomach churned with hunger, though they had eaten only hours before. In Hell Week, hunger was a permanent state. The instructors blew whistles. Chaos began. They ran first, endless miles along the beach, surf slapping at their ankles, sand dragging at their legs. The Gulf roared, cold wind biting through wet clothes. Men stumbled, some fell, but the instructors screamed them forward. Then came the boats. Inflatable rubber IBS boats, each weighing over 200 pounds when wet, slammed onto shoulders. The teams staggered down the shoreline, boats bouncing, crushing skulls against bone. Shoulders tore raw, spines bent. Men screamed curses into the wind. Jake bore the weight in silence. His neck throbbed, his back burned, but he pushed forward. Every step felt like dragging chains, but he refused to slow. When the boat slipped, crashing onto another teammate's shoulder, he shifted, taking the brunt. His legs shook, but he held. "You want to be here, tattoo boy?" An instructor screamed into his face, salt spraying his lips. "Then prove it." He said nothing, only adjusted the weight and kept moving. Hours bled into each other. Push-ups until arms collapsed. Sit-ups until abs tore. Dips, squats, flutter kicks. The grinder's asphalt soaked with sweat and blood. When the Gulf called again, they locked arms, lying in the surf as waves crashed over them. Teeth rattled, chests heaved, eyes glazed with hypothermia. Instructors paced the shoreline, shouting, "Quitting is easy, gentlemen. The bell is right there. Ring it, and all this ends. Hot coffee, dry clothes, a warm bed. All you gotta do is quit." The brass bell sat at the edge of camp, golden under floodlights. Men stared at it, as if hypnotized. That night, 2 recruits broke. Shivering, they stumbled from the surf, helmets tucked under arms, ringing the bell with trembling hands. Each clang echoed like a funeral toll. Jake watched without expression. His lips were blue, his body numb, but inside burned a fire no wave could extinguish. He thought of Michael's last words before deployment. "Don't let me be the last." He would not quit. By the 3rd day, bodies were breaking. Blisters split open, heels shredded to raw flesh. Hands bled from carrying boats and logs. Sleep deprivation blurred reality. Some men swore they saw shapes in the fog, shadows where none existed. Jake felt it, too. Hallucinations crept at the edges of vision. Once, as he ran along the shoreline, he thought he saw Michael jogging beside him, same stride, same laugh. For a moment, his chest swelled with hope, until the vision dissolved into mist. But instead of fear, he felt strength. Michael was with him, not in body, but in memory. The tattoo burned on his arm, each line a reminder. Teamwork was survival. During a night evolution, the teams were ordered to paddle their boats into the surf, crashing against relentless waves. Time after time, boats capsized. Recruits swallowed salt water, dragged each other sputtering back to shore. When one teammate slipped under, thrashing, Jake dove without hesitation. Cold knifed through his chest, lungs screamed for air, but he grabbed the man and hauled him to the surface. On shore, the recruit coughed seawater, collapsing in the sand. He looked up at Jake with wide eyes, too breathless to speak. But gratitude burned clear. The instructors said nothing. They didn't need to. By the 4th day, only half the class remained. The instructors took them to the mud flats, waist-deep muck swallowing legs with every step, stinking of rot and decay. They were ordered to lock arms and lie in the mud, the tide rising slowly, inch by inch, as the cold seeped into marrow. Men screamed, some begged to quit. The instructors taunted them with offers of coffee, blankets, warmth. Jake closed his eyes, head tilted back, mud creeping to his chin. His breath shook, but his jaw set. "I don't quit." The words repeated like a mantra. William had survived jungles. Michael had survived deserts until his last breath. He could survive this. Beside him, Caleb whimpered, "Can't do it, man. Can't." Without opening his eyes, Jake spoke, for the first time in hours. His voice was steady, iron in the muck. "Yes, you can." Caleb's grip tightened. He stayed. By the 5th day, their bodies were shells, eyes hollow, muscles twitching uncontrollably, minds fogged with exhaustion. But something new had formed, too, brotherhood. The same men who had once whispered about his tattoo now leaned on him. When he carried weight, they carried it too. When he refused to quit, they followed. His silence was no longer distance. It was an anchor. And though the tattoo still remained unspoken, they began to understand. It wasn't decoration. It wasn't arrogance. It was survival. Hell Week ended not with triumph, but with collapse. On the final morning, the instructors called them to formation. Sunlight cut across the beach, painting exhausted faces gold. Out of the 100 men who had begun, fewer than 40 remained. The instructor scanned the line, eyes hard but approving. Then Ramirez stepped forward, voice booming. Congratulations. You've survived Hell Week. You've proven you want to be here. But remember this, you are not SEALs yet. This was only the beginning. The men stood, swaying, some barely conscious. Salt and sand crusted to their uniforms. Jake stood among them, shoulders squared, tattoo gleaming faintly in the light. His body screamed, his mind was fog, but inside, something burned stronger than ever. He had not quit, and in his silence, every man beside him understood. The tattoo was not just his story, it was theirs now too. That night, as they staggered back to barracks, someone finally spoke what had been on all their minds. Ethan, voice hoarse, muttered, Hell Week's over. If that tattoo doesn't mean something, it damn well does now. Caleb nodded, too tired to laugh. Jake said nothing. He didn't need to, because in their eyes, in their silence, he saw it. The bond forged in fire. Brotherhood. And from that day forward, no one questioned the mark again. The plane roared through the night sky, a hulking shadow above endless desert. Inside, the men sat in silence, their gear strapped tight, weapons cradled in their arms, faces hidden beneath helmets. They looked less like recruits and more like soldiers carved from stone. It had been months since Hell Week, months of further training, refining every skill. Demolitions, close-quarters combat, advanced diving, parachuting. They had been pushed beyond exhaustion, molded into something leaner, sharper. Now they were SEALs, and they were heading into war. Jake sat near the back of the aircraft, hands folded calmly over his weapon. His eyes were closed, steady breath cutting through the engine's roar. To anyone watching, he seemed asleep, but his mind was awake, replaying the mission brief, mapping routes, remembering faces. The tattoo pulsed beneath his sleeve, lines etched in skin like a promise. He carried it not as a mystery anymore, but as armor. Beside him, Caleb muttered something about missing Whataburger. Across the aisle, Ethan stared silently at the floor, jaw tight. Nerves lingered, though none would admit it aloud. When the green light flashed, they rose as one. Shadows stepped into shadows, leaving the safety of steel behind. The desert welcomed them with silence. Boots crunched sand as they moved under cover of night, the moon a thin blade in the sky. Their breaths were muffled, their rifles extensions of their bodies. Every step was rehearsed, every signal precise. The mission was simple on paper, recon and capture. Intelligence suggested a compound ahead housed a high-value target. In reality, nothing in combat was simple. Jake moved in formation, his senses alive. He could feel the rhythm of his team, hear every scrape of boot, every shift of gear. The tattoo burned faintly, as though reminding him, don't falter. They reached the compound's edge, crouched low against crumbling walls. Ramirez, now their commander, gave the silent signal. The breach began. Explosives blew the gate inward, dust and fire tearing through the night. Shouts erupted from inside, foreign words laced with alarm. The SEALs surged forward, rifles cutting arcs of controlled chaos. Jake was among the first through, his weapon steady, eyes scanning. Adrenaline thundered through him, but his movements were precise, almost calm. He swept corners, advanced room by room, until gunfire cracked from the far hall. Bullets tore plaster above their heads. One teammate stumbled, pinned down. Without hesitation, Jake surged forward, dropping to a knee, laying suppressing fire until the others pulled the injured man clear. In the smoke and shouting, his sleeve rolled back. The tattoo glistened under harsh light, black lines stark against sweat-slicked skin. For a fleeting second, one of his teammates saw it and felt steadier, as if the ink itself carried the same vow they had all made in Hell Week. I don't quit. The firefight ended in minutes. The target was captured, the compound secured, but the weight of battle clung to them long after silence returned. Combat became routine. Missions blurred raids in desert villages, night swims into hostile harbors, helicopter insertions onto mountainsides. Each op carried danger, and each time, someone almost didn't make it back. But they always did. In those moments, when exhaustion gripped them and fear gnawed at their edges, the tattoo seemed to surface again. During one mission, when their boat engine failed under fire, Caleb glanced at Jake, saw the ink peeking from his sleeve, and clenched his jaw. "Not tonight," he muttered, paddling harder. Another time, pinned down on a rooftop as dawn broke, Ethan swore he caught sight of it as Jake reloaded calmly. He didn't say anything, but later admitted to himself it steadied him more than any weapon. The mystery of the tattoo had faded. What mattered now was the weight it carried. But war is not only fought on battlefields. Between missions, the men found themselves in barren outposts, dust swirling through tents, heat pressing like a second skin. They laughed over bad rations, played cards under dim lights, shared stories of home, and sometimes their eyes drifted again to Jake's arm. It was Caleb who finally asked, late one night after a mission gone too close, "You ever gonna tell us, brother, what that thing means?" His voice wasn't mocking, not curious like before. It was softer, laced with respect. Jake sat back, rifle leaning against the wall, a tin of cold rations half empty beside him. His gaze lingered on the tattoo, tracing its familiar lines. For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then he spoke. "My father carried it in his heart. My brother carried it to his grave. I carry it here." He tapped the ink. "It means I don't quit. Ever." The fire in his tone silenced the room. No one asked again. They didn't need to. Weeks turned into months. Deployments bled into each other until time was marked not by calendars, but by missions and losses. Jake changed too. His movements grew sharper, his voice firmer. He wasn't just another SEAL. He was becoming a cornerstone. Men looked to him when the night stretched longest, when fear threatened to unravel courage. The tattoo had become part of the team, a quiet emblem carried into every firefight. They didn't speak of it, but they all knew. Then came the mission that tested them all, a nighttime raid in the mountains. Intelligence reported a fortified hideout, enemy fighters well armed. It was dangerous even by their standards. They moved under moonlight, shadows against jagged rock. The climb was brutal, gear weighing like chains, thin air cutting into lungs. By the time they reached the compound, dawn was near. The breach went wrong. Alarms blared before they entered. Gunfire erupted from every window. Pinned down, low on ammo, the SEALs fought tooth and nail. Caleb was grazed in the leg, bleeding but pushing forward. Ethan lost his helmet to a bullet that whizzed past his skull. Chaos reigned. And through it all, Jake moved like a force of nature, calm, precise, unrelenting. When a door needed breaching, he was there. When fire needed covering, he stepped forward. At one point, dragging a wounded man to safety, his sleeve tore completely, exposing the tattoo in full. Dust and blood smeared across it, but the lines remained bold, unbroken. One teammate, trembling as he reloaded, glanced at it and whispered, "We don't quit." The words spread like a ripple in the chaos. Each man clung to it. "We don't quit." Not one of them faltered. When the firefight ended, when silence fell and the compound lay secured, every man was still alive, bruised, bloodied, but alive. That night, back at base, Ramirez gathered them. His voice was gruff, but his eyes held weight. "You fought like hell," he said. "I've seen men break under half that fire, but you didn't." His gaze lingered on Jake, then the tattoo. "And I think I know why." No one spoke. They didn't need to. The Brotherhood understood now. The tattoo was not just his vow. It had become theirs, too. The desert wind howled outside the tents that night, but inside there was silence, not the silence of distance, but of understanding. Jake lay on his cot, staring at the ink on his arm. For the first time since he carved it into his skin, he felt its weight lessen, not because the vow had weakened, but because he no longer carried it alone. He smiled faintly, a rare crack in his stoicism. The vow lived in all of them now. We don't quit. And in the shadows of war, that promise was the only light they needed. The desert never truly slept. Even at night, when the sun's furnace had slipped below the horizon, heat clung to the earth like a curse. Wind pushed through valleys, carrying whispers of sand, scattering them against tents and steel. Somewhere far away, a dog barked, then silence. The outpost was quiet that night, quieter than usual. The men sat scattered, some cleaning weapons, others writing letters home they'd never sent. Ramirez studied maps, frowning under dim light. Jake sat on his cot, rolling a strip of cloth between his fingers. His arm lay bare, the tattoo dark against his skin. He wasn't hiding it anymore. He didn't need to. Everyone in that tent knew what it meant now. And yet, something gnawed at Hemo, weight heavier than gear, a silence heavier than the desert. The mission brief came the next morning. A local informant had tipped them off about a high-level meeting between insurgent leaders deep in the mountains. If true, it could cripple enemy operations for months. If false, it could be a trap. Ramirez knew the risk. But orders came from above. They were going in. The team packed in silence. No nervous chatter, no jokes about food or women waiting at home. Just the quiet rhythm of men preparing for war. As they loaded into the helicopter, Jake caught Caleb's eye. The big man gave a crooked grin, but his eyes betrayed unease. Ethan sat across from them, lips pressed into a thin line. Jake tugged his sleeve, exposing the ink for a brief moment. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Caleb exhaled slowly, nodding once. Ethan looked too, then gave a sharp, resolute grin. The vow was alive. Even here, even now. The drop zone was barren, jagged rock, thin air, shadows that seemed to move. The helicopter peeled away, leaving only silence and the faint starlight above. They moved uphill, breath shallow, boots scraping against stone. Hours passed, and mountains closed around them like jaws. Then the ambush came. Gunfire split the silence, echoing across the cliffs. Bullets sparked against stone. Voices shouted in the darkness, surrounding them. The informant's intelligence had been bait. The SEALs dove for cover, returning fire with disciplined bursts. Dust and smoke filled the air. Ramirez barked orders, his voice cutting through chaos. Jake pressed against a boulder, heart pounding. He scanned through his sights, squeezing rounds into the night. Beside him, Caleb cursed as his radio crackled, jammed. Too many of them. Ethan hissed, reloading. But retreat wasn't an option. They were boxed in. Jake's tattoo burned hot against his arm, sweat stinging as it mixed with dirt. Don't quit. The vow thundered in his skull. He rose, laid covering fire, buying his brothers time to reposition. Minutes stretched like hours. Each second, another bullet whizzed past. Then came the explosion. A rocket slammed into the ridge above. The world shook, stone split, fire roared. Men were thrown like ragdolls. When the dust cleared, Ramirez was down, blood pooling beneath him, his breath ragged. Go, he rasped. Finish it. But none of them moved. Jake knelt by him, gripping his shoulder. We don't leave you. Ramirez's eyes burned. That's an order. Jake shook his head, jaw tight. We don't quit. That includes you. The words weren't defiance. They were a vow, the same vow etched in ink, now pressed into flesh and blood. Ramirez's gaze lingered on the tattoo, smeared with dirt and sweat. Then, for the first time in months, his mouth twitched into something like a smile. Then don't quit on me now. The firefight dragged on. The SEALs were running dry, ammo low, comms jammed, enemy numbers unending. Silence became their weapon. Hand signals replaced shouts. Footsteps pressed into rock like whispers. Every move, every breath, every shot was calculated. Jake led through quiet. His tattoo, once a secret, now a beacon. When his sleeve rolled back, when the ink caught the faint moonlight, the others steadied themselves. They fought like shadows, unseen, unheard, relentless. Hours later, the mountains fell silent again. Bodies littered the rocks. Smoke curled into the dawn. The SEALs had survived, but not without cost. Ramirez was airlifted out, his condition critical. Caleb had taken shrapnel in his thigh, limping but alive. Ethan's hands shook for hours after, though he never admitted fear aloud. And Jake, he sat alone that night, staring at the tattoo under the pale glow of a lantern. For years, it had been his vow, his shield, his silence. But now it wasn't just his. It belonged to all of them. He thought of Ramirez, pale against the dirt, whispering, "Don't quit on me now." He thought of Caleb's nod in the helicopter, Ethan's grin. The ink wasn't just lines. It wasn't just Williams or Michaels. It was a thread binding them, a reminder that silence wasn't emptiness. Silence was strength. And in that silence, they endured. Days passed. New orders came. Another mission loomed. But something had changed. The men spoke less now, even in downtime, not out of fear or exhaustion, but out of understanding. They didn't need words. They didn't need noise. They had silence. They had the vow. When Caleb polished his rifle, he muttered the words under his breath. We don't quit. When Ethan wrapped fresh tape around his boots, he glanced at the tattoo and nodded, as if to himself. And when Ramirez, bandaged and pale, was flown out of country, his last words before boarding were simple. Keep that vow alive. The helicopter lifted, carrying him away. Jake stood there, sleeve rolled up, ink bared to the sun. He didn't speak, he didn't salute. He only watched, silent as ever. And somehow, the silence was louder than any farewell. The next mission would come soon. Danger would return. Some of them might not make it back, but they carried the vow. And in the unforgiving quiet of war, that vow was enough. We don't quit. The desert wind had teeth that night. It clawed across the outpost, rattling canvas, whispering through empty crates. Jake sat alone on a crate by the landing pad, staring into the endless dark. His gear lay beside him, cleaned and ready. But his thoughts wandered far from the war. For weeks, the tattoo had burned in his mind, not from regret, never that, but from recognition. It wasn't just his vow anymore. It was theirs, all of theirs. A brotherhood had branded itself in silence. But there was something else, something unfinished, and it came in the form of the helicopter that cut through the sky at midnight, blades thrumming like a heartbeat. The men gathered as the bird landed, kicking up dust and sand. Out stepped a figure none of them expected. Commander Hank Sullivan. Every SEAL knew his name. Decorated veteran, shadow of wars fought in silence. Whispers said he'd led missions that never made it to paper, saved men who never spoke of it. He was older now, but not diminished. His presence was weight steady, unyielding. Caleb muttered under his breath. Hell, why's he here? Ethan shrugged, but his knuckles tightened on his rifle. Jake said nothing. He couldn't, because the moment Sullivan stepped into the light, his gaze had fallen not on Ramirez's absence, not on the men, not even on the mission briefing, but on the tattoo. It wasn't a casual glance. It was recognition, a flash of memory. Sullivan's jaw shifted just slightly, as if an old wound had stirred. Then, like a soldier sealing a vault, he looked away. But Jake had seen it. So had the others. The briefing came quick and cold. Intelligence confirmed an arms convoy moving through mountain passes within 48 hours. Their task: interdiction, ambush, neutralization, extraction. Simple on paper, deadly in execution. But Sullivan wasn't just there to deliver orders. I'll be leading this one, he said. The men exchanged stunned glances. Commanders didn't usually lead ambushes in the field. Not anymore. Caleb raised a brow. With respect, sir, why? Sullivan's eyes swept the room, finally resting on Jake. Because some missions require old ghosts. No one asked again. Preparation buzzed through the outpost. Ethan sharpened his blade until sparks danced in the low light. Caleb wrapped his thigh in fresh bandages, grunting with every pull, but refusing to sit out. And Jake, he found himself pulled into silence deeper than usual, because he had questions that burned hotter than the desert sun. Why had Sullivan looked at the tattoo that way? Why had his eyes, hard as steel, flickered with something dangerously close to grief? He wanted to ask, but silence had always been his shield. The night before the mission, Sullivan sat alone in the mess tent, sipping black coffee that steamed in the cold air. Jake entered, intending only to refill his canteen, but Sullivan's voice stopped him. That tattoo. Jake froze. Slowly he turned. Sullivan's gaze was steady, not unkind, but heavy. Where'd you get it? Jake hesitated, then answered in the same low voice he always used when words were necessary. It was my brother's. Sullivan set his cup down, eyes narrowing slightly. Your brother's name. Jake spoke at Michaeland for the first time in years. Sullivan flinched. The silence stretched long. Then Sullivan leaned back, breath leaving him like a man struck in the gut. I knew him, he said. Jake's chest tightened. His throat burned, but he didn't speak. Sullivan's eyes grew distant, haunted. Afghanistan, years back. We ran a joint op in the Helmand Valley. Your brother was there, braver than most, stubborn as hell. Carried his team through fire. He paused. His hand brushed the edge of his sleeve, as if remembering something burned into his own skin. He showed me that tattoo once. Said it wasn't just ink. Said it was a vow that no matter what happened, he'd never quit. And neither would the men who followed him. Jake's vision blurred. His throat worked, but no words came. Sullivan leaned forward, voice low, steady. He died with that vow on his lips. You carrying it know it's not coincidence. It's legacy. The silence between them wasn't emptiness. It was full of memory, of grief, of respect. And for the first time, Jake realized Sullivan didn't just recognize the tattoo. He saluted it. The mission began before dawn. They moved like shadows through the mountains, cold biting at fingers, silenced their armor. The convoy came into view, trucks rumbling along narrow passes, headlights cutting through dust. Sullivan raised a hand. The team froze. Positions taken. Breaths held. Then chaos. An explosion ripped through the lead truck, fire lighting the mountainside. Seals rained down from above, unleashing precision fury. Bullets tore through steel and sand. The convoy scattered, insurgents scrambling for cover. Jake moved without thought, rifle steady, tattoo burning under his sleeve. Beside him, Sullivan fought like a man decades younger, every motion sharp, efficient, deadly. But more than that, he fought with silence, commanding through gestures, leading with presence. The vow was alive in him, too. But battles are never clean. A second convoy appeared, reinforcements spilling from the ridge. The fight turned pinned down, low on ammo, the seals pressed tighter to stone. Caleb cursed, blood seeping fresh through his bandages. Ethan hissed, "We're boxed in." Sullivan scanned the ridge, calculating. Then his eyes found Jake. He signaled a maneuver risky, near suicidal, a flank through exposed ground, drawing fire, buying time for the others. Jake met his gaze, and in that moment, no words passed, only silencious silence that said, "I know the vow. I carry it, too." Jake nodded once. Then he moved. Bullets cracked past as he sprinted low, weaving through fire. Dust stung his eyes, heat licked his back, but he didn't quit. He fired, drew attention, became the shadow the enemy couldn't pin down. The seals surged forward, seizing the opening. Grenades lit the ridge. Trucks exploded. Insurgents fell. Minutes later, the valley was silent again. The seals regrouped, battered but alive. Sullivan approached Jake, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You've got his fire," he said quietly. "And his silence." Jake's throat ached, but he only nodded. Sullivan's gaze dropped to the tattoo. Then, in front of all the men, he did something no one expected. He knelt not out of weakness, but respect, one knee in the dust, head bowed slightly toward the ink. A salute without words. The men stared, stunned. Caleb's mouth fell open. Ethan blinked, silent for once. Sullivan rose, eyes steady. "That vow doesn't die with men. It lives in those who carry it. Your brother, you, now us." The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. It was sacred. The vow was no longer just ink, no longer just memory. It was legacy, sealed in dust and blood, bound now by commander and team alike. "We don't quit." That night, back at the outpost, no one spoke much. They didn't need to. But when Jake stripped off his gear and sat beneath the desert stars, tattoo bare on his arm, he knew one truth clearer than ever. The vow wasn't his alone. It never had been. And tomorrow, when war came again, they would all carry it together. The desert never gave back what it took. Men returned from missions with sweat, scars, and silence clinging to them, but pieces of themselves were left buried in the sand forever. The SEALs knew this truth well. They carried it in the lines of their faces, in the calluses on their hands, in the quiet way they looked at one another when the firefight was over. But after the ambush in the mountains, something had shifted. It wasn't the blood on their uniforms, nor the ache in their bones. It wasn't even the sight of the burning trucks crumbling into ash behind them. It was the image burned into memory, impossible to erase, of Sullivan kneeling before the tattoo, a gesture so simple, yet so seismic it rearranged the way they thought about vows, about brotherhood, about the very silence they lived by. Jake didn't speak of it. He never did. But as dawn bled across the desert sky the next morning, he sat alone outside the outpost, rolling his sleeve back, tracing the sharp edges of ink with a finger. Michael's vow, his vow, now their vow. Caleb emerged first, limping, bandages red, but spirit unbroken. He paused when he saw Jake, then lowered himself slowly onto the sand beside him. For once, he didn't make a joke, didn't fill the air with chatter. He just sat, silent, looking at the mark. Minutes later, Ethan joined them, dropping into a cross-legged sprawl. His blade hung at his side, sharpened to a razor point. He glanced once at the tattoo, then leaned back, exhaling a long breath. By the time the others drifted out, something wordless was already happening. No speeches, no orders, no forced camaraderie, just silence, the kind that bound men tighter than blood. Sullivan approached last, his boots pressing heavy into the sand, his eyes lined from years of war. He stood before them, surveying not just his men, but his legacy. He didn't kneel this time. He didn't need to. Instead, he spoke softly, voice like gravel rubbed smooth by water. War will take more from you than you'll ever get back. But this, he nodded toward the tattoo, this is something war can't touch. A vow doesn't die. It carries. The men listened. Not one moved. You carry it, Sullivan continued. You pass it. And one day, when you're gone, others will carry it, too. That's how silence becomes louder than any bullet. His gaze swept them once more and softened on Jake. Your brother would have been proud. The words cut deeper than shrapnel, but they healed, too. Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to, because in that silence, he accepted the vow not just as ink on his arm, but as fire in his blood. Weeks turned into months. Missions came and went, each one testing them harder, stretching the vow thinner, but never breaking it. The tattoo remained a silent standard, guiding them through fire and fog. And everywhere they went, Sullivan's kneel followed not physically, but in spirit, a symbol burned into their memories, echoing whenever doubt tried to seep in. Caleb began sketching it in his notebook. Kneel, a bowed head, a mark above. Ethan carved it into the handle of his blade. Others found ways to carry it, little talismans of respect born from one moment of reverence. It wasn't worship. It wasn't ceremony. It was recognition that sometimes the loudest vow is spoken without words. One night, deep in a forward operating base far from home, Jake found himself staring at the stars again. The war hummed around him, radios crackling, engines groaning, distant booms rolling like thunder. But his mind wandered back to Michael, to the day they'd last spoken, the way his brother had clasped his shoulder and said only, "You'll know what it means when it matters." He hadn't understood then. He understood now. A shadow moved behind him. Sullivan stepped up, silent as always. Can't sleep? Jake shook his head. Sullivan followed his gaze to the sky. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Sullivan said, "Your brother once told me the same thing, that I'd know what it meant when it mattered." Jake turned. He was right, Sullivan said simply. For once, Jake allowed a ghost of a smile. 2 generations, bound by one vow, staring into the same stars. Months later, the deployment ended. The war wars never did, but rotations shifted, and eventually the men found themselves back on American soil. Pensacola, the same sands where it all began. Graduation day shimmered under the Florida sun, waves crashing like applause in the distance. Families gathered in rows of folding chairs, flags rippling overhead. Instructors barked orders one final time, though pride hid beneath their gruff tones. The men stood in formation, tridents pinned to their uniforms, each bearing scars invisible and otherwise. And in the front row sat Sullivan, shoulders square, eyes steady. When Jake's name was called, he stepped forward, chest out, the tattoo hidden beneath his sleeve. He accepted the pin, saluted, turned. For a heartbeat, his eyes found Sullivan's. And in that silent glance, the vow passed again, unspoken, but louder than the cheers. Years later, the story spread not in headlines, not in books, but in whispers in barracks and training yards. They thought it was just a tattoo. That was how it always began. Recruits would lean forward, wide-eyed, as older SEALs told of the vow, of the silence, of the day the commander himself had knelt in the dust. Some thought it myth. Others swore they'd seen the mark carried by men who still served. But myth or not, the story did what it was meant to do. It carried the vow forward. One day, long after Jake's war was done, a boy sat on a beach in Destin, sand sticking to his bare feet, listening to the surf. Beside him sat his father, older now, hair silver at the edges, but eyes still sharp. The boy pointed to the mark on his father's arm. What's that mean? Jake looked at it, fingers tracing the lines that had been there longer than the boy had been alive. It means, he said quietly, that no matter what happens, you don't quit. You stand. You carry on. Even when you can't speak, you keep going. And one day, if you're strong enough, you'll carry it, too. The boy's eyes widened. Did Grandpa have it? Jake's throat tightened. Yes. And someone before him? Jake smiled faintly. Yes, someone before him, too. The boy sat in silence, watching the waves. Jake leaned back, feeling the sun warm his face, the vow warm his heart. The tattoo wasn't just his anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. It was theirs. And as long as someone carried it, Sullivan's kneel would echo through Tamia, salute not to a man, but to a vow that refused to die. The desert had taken much. The ocean had tested more. But the silence they carried had given something greater back, a story, a promise, a vow. And long after the battles faded into dust, that vow remained, inked not just on skin, but in the marrow of those who chose to bear it. They thought it was just a tattoo, but they never knew how loud silence could be.